Interesting.
While we're at, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the London Month of the Dead.
Can I share screen or not?
Hang on, let me let you share a screen. Hang on. Here we go.
1 second.
There you go. Yeah, should be able to now.
Okay, let me well let's I don't know who can hear me. Let's have a look. Oops. Well, this can you see that or not?
No, not yet.
Hold on a minute. Let me just share my screen. Share. Let's have a look. Here we go. You see that?
Yep.
Okay, right. Well, this is this year's. Hello, everybody. If you can hear me, I'm Stephen. I co-curate this crazy festival every year. It's called London Month of the Dead, and this is this year's program. Each of these is an event of some sort. We do. You can see here. These are the talks. Um. Oops. Well, there we go. Right at the top there, Sarah. Gary Lackman on top left.
Mm,
Mind Benders of Mayfair. A talk on satanic swinging London. That's about this really weird cult called the Process Church, that was kind of influenced by Anton LaVey. But they were based in Mayfair, of all places. And we're actually, some of our talks are at Mayfair Library. You can actually, which is this lovely, beautiful building. So these are all talks here. They're all kind of death adjacent, I would say. The festival's death, about death in the arts and the city. So we have everything from historical stuff to kind of weird. I mean, this Katie is giving a talk about human art made from human skin. Um, this is interesting. This is a talk about corpse roads. Maybe people have heard about these. These were throughout these islands and probably in many other places, rural places. There were corpse roads where people who lived far from churches, there would be particular routes that they would take the coffin when somebody had died to the church. For instance, in the on the west coast of uh, some islands off Scotland, the west coast is the it's very stony, so you can't bury people. So they have to be buried on the east of the island. So there will be a corpse road from the west to the east. Um, we've got stuff about psychoanalysis. Look, Death on Screen, a psychoanalytic journey through horror cinema. Anyway, blah blah blah. These are all talks, you see. Um, and then we do various storytelling and concerts. Seance actually with Roy Roberts. This is at the Kensal Green Cemetery. Roy is a blind medium. Don't know if that makes a difference or not. Obviously, he can see the other world.
Vision, isn't it, to be a blind medium?
Is that right? I didn't know that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have films and all sorts of stuff. We also do walks and visits, walks to strange parts. Well, walks through cemeteries and to visit strange parts of the city. There's one particular thing I'm very excited about. So this is a mausoleum in a graveyard in southwest London, and this is particularly interesting because this is the mausoleum of Richard Burton, not the actor Richard Burton, but the Victorian explorer. And inside is a collection of his esoteric ethnographic objects, including, I
Oh,
think
didn't he work as an Egyptologist?
he
And he's
did.
got
He
a shaped tomb in St Leonard's as well. The Burton
I didn't
family,
know that.
they
Yeah.
Nestle Burton designed St Leonard's.
Yeah, I mean, he was a big influence on Crowley. I think actually, I'm not sure. There may be some of the objects in there belong to Crowley, actually. Anyway, yeah, so he went in search of the source of the Nile, etc. Also, he's first person to translate the Kama Sutra. Anyway, that is, Billy, like a tent. It's like a sort of tent. That's his mausoleum. It's not usually open to people, but we've got in there, and then lots of other stuff. There we go. There's a lot of there's a lot in the workshops. Sarah's done a workshop for us before. We've got Moon Magic this year. We've got Tarot, and we've got Danny who's here. Where's Danny? Danny's here somewhere. Danny is doing. Where is he?
Hi.
Oh, there you are, Danny. The language of the hand. There we go. Beginner's palmistry workshop with Danny Nemu. There we go. That's it. Right, that's me.
Oh, thank you
Well,
so much. And
that
also,
was
loads of the events take place in actual graveyards, right?
most of
In
them
some of the
do. Most of them do.
species.
Yeah, yeah. They are mainly actually sold out. I have to say. Have a quick look. Yeah, lots of them sold out. Danny's not sold out though. Come on, Danny. Put a bit more effort in.
Well, this is a good opportunity to plug your. You're not going to be telling people when they're going to die, are you, Danny?
Uh, Not with any great certainty. No. Is there anything happening at the Brompton Cemetery? Like,
There's lots happening at Brompton Cemetery.
are you revisiting the? I was just thinking on the subject of death. I'm wondering if like a few words about the Brompton time machine might be appropriate.
Well, I'm giving a talk about the time machine. For Victor Wind, yeah, yeah, an online talk, yeah. So there is, folks, there is a mausoleum in the Brompton Cemetery. It's the Call the Courtois Mausoleum, which is reputed to be or to contain a time machine. This is a myth that's been going for many years. I did a lot of research into it over the last few years, and the obviously whether or not you believe it's a time machine is sort of secondary to the fact that the woman who it belonged to, who built it, definitely believed that she was building a time machine, or tried to anyway. She was extremely rich. Um,
Who tried to build it? Whose was it?
Hannah Courtois is her name. But she employed the help of two people, Joseph Bonamy, who was a tomb raider, Egyptologist, and Samuel Warner, who this sounds like I'm making it up as I go along, but this is all this bit is true. Samuel Warner was a captain in the Navy, but he also claimed to have invented psychic weapons, a psychic torpedo, which he tried to sell to the Navy. And he did successfully remotely explode a ship off Brighton, which is all documented. And then still, even though the Navy decided that they wouldn't give him the money which he asked for the psychic torpedo because he wouldn't tell them how he did it, which is fair enough, they still don't know how he did it. There's been various theories put forward that he tied a bomb to a pigeon, which seems unlikely, I think, um, and a bit unfair to the pigeon.
Psychic torpedo is much more likely.
Yeah, so that's the Brompton Temple. That's the mausoleum. So I'll be giving a talk on all that stuff. Yeah, but
That place is the most dense magic. It's one of the most densely magical parts of London. Every time I go there, something crazy happens. And the last, was it not quite the last time I went there, but I went there about two or three times I went there ago. I went with someone who has absolutely no sense of direction. And as we went in, I said to her, "Go and find the mausoleum." And she went, "No, no, no, I can't. You know, I'm rubbish." And there's something like, is it 38 hectares or something?
mm,
And tens of thousands of gravestones. And she started going the right way, and then she took a left, went past Emmeline Pankhurst's grave, took a left, which was the right way, took a right, which was the right way, took a left, which was the right way, took a right, and then she kind of went beyond it. And I was shouting at the dead, going, "No, no, no," because she was doing really well. And then she took another right, and actually she was there, and she'd found almost the perfect direct route to this to the time machine that she'd never been for, and
mm.
I'd got lost. And then as soon as we arrived, this poem came into my head, which I'm just going to share the first four lines of it because it's good for this particular gathering. It goes like this: it goes, "Between the living and the dead, between the body and the head, between the letter and the line, we find ourselves in space and time."
Mm. Very good, Danny. Very good. Yeah, yeah. It is a very special place. I agree. And the story of it, the story of the attempt to build a time machine is interesting. Yeah.
I'm going to plug Stephen. Stephen's got one of the most interesting sound recordings you can possibly hear on the internet, which I think is SoundCloud. It's called the Brompton Time Machine, and it's
Mm.
Stephen telling a story of that particular time machine for about 25 minutes. It's hauntingly brilliant storytelling. He's
Thank you.
underplaying it here.
Thank you, Danny.
Thank you, you two. Well, I thought actually we might begin. We've got some amazingly interesting people on the panel, Stephen and Danny obviously included. But I would really like to bring in Gregory Shushan now because Gregory is an expert on ancient near-death experiences and has worked as
Wow.
an Egyptologist, right? And in comparative religion. So, and you've written a book about near-death experiences. So maybe, Gregory, you can introduce yourself and tell us a little bit from your perspective.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I haven't really worked as an Egyptologist, but I did my first degree was in Egyptian archaeology at UCL. But then I defected to religious studies because I started looking at wanted to do the cross-cultural comparative afterlife belief stuff. And so then I went to University of Wales in Lampeter, and kind of everything snowballed from that point, and I've been doing this kind of thing for like 25 years now. So, and I've just finished a second PhD, which I did only because it was the only way I could get funding on NDEs in classical antiquity, and so that's my Viva's next month, and then that should be published sort of next year. So, but it's all been kind of focused on the ancient world cross-culturally, and then another study I did, which was on indigenous, small-scale societies around the world and how they kind of interpreted NDEs and how they integrated them into their belief systems or not. So that's kind of the nutshell, really.
What have you found in terms of near-death experiences cross-culturally? Are there particularly interesting themes that you're exploring?
Yeah. Um, it's an interesting thing because what I've part of the kind of offshoot of what I've been trying to do is getting near-death studies people to start taking the cross-cultural and historical dimensions a bit more seriously, because you still read when you look at journal articles in Journal of Near-Death Studies or whatever, these kind of ridiculous generalizations where people say when NDEs are found around the world, they're all the same. Or on the opposite end of the spectrum, they'll say things like, if NDEs were true, then why don't we find them in other civilizations or other societies? And it's like they're making these generalizations without having done any research. They're just kind of unfounded assumptions. So what I've tried to do is get beyond that oversimplifying perspective on they're all the same or they don't exist, and kind of showing that they actually do exist, but they're also different. So how can we kind of grapple with those differences? Um, for me, it's more interesting as a, you know, history of religions, historical, cultural sort of response to this phenomena, but it also has the kind of implications for the ontological interpretation of NDEs themselves. And so that's where I kind of dip a toe into that world sometimes to to try to bring about those changes. So just like one example is, in our kind of typical Western model of near-death experiences that goes back to Raymond Moody's book in 1975, Life After Life. The life review is like this kind of, everyone sees it as like this typical, stereotypical element of an NDE that your, a being of light appears and then your whole life flashes before your eyes in a moment. And sometimes they even describe like you even feel empathetically, you feel the emotions of the people that you've interacted with throughout your life. So you'll feel their pain or you'll feel their love or whatever it is. Um, and that model of a life review basically does not exist outside the contemporary Western idea of what an NDE is. So there are, certain kind of thematic parallels in different cultures where like there's a Native American example where the Native American guy is having his NDE and he's having this kind of judgment scene with a white European judging sort of figure, and there's a photograph on the wall behind him, and somehow that photograph like embodies all of his life's deeds, which is, it's kind of a thematically similar thing, but it's not a panoramic life review. So um and like the significance of that as far as like the reality and ontological interpretation of NDEs is, um so if it's all in the brain, as skeptics say, then why isn't everybody having a panoramic NDE? Why, if it's like the cognitive fluidity of the brain just kind of explodes at the moment of death and your brain is flooded with all of your memories, then why isn't that happening cross-culturally if we all have, physiologically essentially the same brains? And then for people who want to say this is really is evidence of an afterlife, then the question is, why is an afterlife different for everybody? Why is everyone having a different type of afterlife experience? And so it's not so much that I'm saying like neither option is true, but like these are questions that people need to be engaging with before they start making blanket statements about NDEs per se and about cross-cultural NDEs more generally. So
With regards to the life review and the judgment, it just reminds me of the kind of hall of judgment in the Duat and Egyptian and other cultures having this idea of the soul being judged or the heart being weighed, these kind of things. Is the presence of the life review reflective of our more kind of like ego, like individualistic way of seeing the world, do you think?
yeah, that's interesting. Alan Kelly here, who's a sociologist, he had a book, Experiences Near Death, I think 1996. And it was like before there was really much cross-cultural work done at all. He had, 6 or 8 examples from small-scale societies, and he didn't find any life reviews, and he was kind of trying to figure out why. And that was exactly what he came up with, that because these are not individualistic focused societies, everything's about the community, that there's not really any it doesn't make any kind of logical cultural sense to them to have an individualized life review because everything's on behalf of the community. Why they didn't have like community life reviews, though, is kind of another another question. But there is, there's kind of tantalizing little bits of evidence. Like there's an Egyptian text called the Teaching for King Merikare, and in that it describes, the what the king is kind of wishing for in his afterlife journey. And it says something like, his life plays before him in an hour, which kind of sounds like, and it's before the gods. So the gods are kind of facilitating his life playing out before him. So could
Sounds
be
a lot
interpreted
like
that.
doesn't it?
It
One of
does.
the other things that I think of as being a kind of generic component of the near-death experience is this going towards the light. And the
Yeah.
light, is that something that we see consistently across different cultures?
Yeah, the light definitely is, but like the means of getting to the other world is different. Like our conception is speeding through a dark tunnel, and cross-culturally that doesn't really happen with any kind of real consistency. So, like in the Pacific, for example, there are a few accounts. That's what's interesting too, is like these are patterns. It's not just one account that's an anomaly. Um, there are accounts from the Pacific where people described having an NDE and they walking along a path or a road to the spirit village, and they will like look down and see the footprints of the ghosts that had gone there before them. And there's one example where there's somebody's walking to the other world and they see somebody walking in the opposite direction, and because they had just had their NDE and they're walking back to their body, which is quite cool.
Wow,
Um,
that's cool. Would that class as a kind of um a verified NDE, like these ideas of having near-death experiences, seeing someone who's died, these kind of NDEs that are proven as providing the experiencer with information they couldn't have access to otherwise.
yeah, I don't think that one would, because the person or the woman actually having the NDE didn't go back and verify that that person had come back to life. So, but there are examples where that happens, where yeah, two people, either known or unknown to each other, meet while they're having an NDE. They meet in the other world, and then they, meet up later in life and confirm that it actually happened.
Can I
Do you
ask a
get some
question? Can I ask a question?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, I was curious, like cross-culturally, in the sense of in near-death experiences, the sense of meeting your ancestors, meeting your loved ones that have already passed over. Is that something that you kind of explored or
Yeah,
found
that's
out?
definitely practically universal, I would
Mm.
say. Yeah, that's one of the most common ones, which makes sense because if the idea is that they're going to the afterlife world, it's got to be populated by dead people. So, um, yeah, and it's often this Hawaiian example I'm thinking of, like she meets her son who had died before her. So it's often people who are like um, poignant sort of loved ones that they lost it's my mom was just asking me the other day. She's terrified of the idea of dying and meeting her mother because her mother is a horrible person. She's like, "Do you know any examples of people who meet somebody who they really despise?" And I don't think there are any. So which is pretty interesting.
Oh,
And that's
that's
a cross thing.
promising, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Pascal, are you awake? Well, Pascal, Gregory was your supervisor, right? When you were studying NDEs?
No, my Viva, my final Viva examiner.
Oh, your examiner. Have you got puppies to hand by any chance?
No, regrettably, they're downstairs.
Don't you?
But they're
Oh,
alive. They're very much representing life.
oh, that's good. Excellent. So Pascal, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your research as well, leading on from Gregory, because you're an ND researcher now, right?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't come to this in any way prepared, to be honest. There's, so there's a million things I could say. I mean, there are some interesting things that I could pick up from what Gregory was saying. But yeah, I mean, the near-death experiences. Maybe it'd be better if going forward, it can be a bit more conversational, because I'd just like to say just the strangeness of this panel being today, because it's the exact 5-year anniversary of when my own dad passed away, and it's so I've obviously been reflecting on it a lot today, um, and so may have a bit more of a passive like posture to this panel, but it brings up other questions. Like throughout my whole PhD, I was obviously obsessed with the kind of ontological ideas and implications of all this stuff, and is it real? What evidence can we marshal? And it all became there's a lot of kind of nuanced materialist neuroscience, which is always fundamental, um, and it seems to explain a great deal, but there are still interesting anomalies, and so there's that whole path psychologically of kind of getting quite fixated on all, how far does the neuroscience go and how much can you narrow down the anomaly space, but does it ever vanish, and if not, you know that may mean that there is some beyond there, and what does that mean? And it all becomes very overwhelming, actually. So when coming to today, in my experience of this anniversary, um the questions which some years ago which started to emerge, those questions have been kind of, they're the priority for me really now, in terms of the meaning of it all, personally, emotionally, spiritually, as opposed to kind of the evidence here, like for the you know for or against, um and especially grief, and what encounters, like with near-death experience or psychedelic experiences or whatever it is, um what what do they really mean? Well, how grief can actually be considered as a similar experience, and how it can actually precipitate uh, comparable experiences to these NDEs and or psychedelics, and what can really be gained, not just in terms of dwelling on death or the afterlife, but what material import it has for our everyday lives, and then this balance as well, lastly, between how constructive it is to like meditate on death and mortality,
and how unproductive it can be, and just in what way can you have a relationship with the understanding of our immortality, like regardless of um, life beyond life or not. Um, what without it, while preserving the fruitfulness that it has for your imminent, undeniable life going forward, basically.
Pascal. I know that you spoke to mediums, or your mum spoke to mediums. Is that something that made you feel comforted about life after death? Is life after death something that you want to exist?
Yeah, I mean that's a good thing to bring up in terms of mediumship, because I think it's very double-edged. Like the popular kind of understanding of it is that it can bring a lot of peace during the grieving, bereavement like process, and I know, I've spoken to many mediums, and there it's very benevolent of them that they feel like they have a healing profession. They facilitate the grieving process and everything, but I'd be really interested to look at like systematic, like how that is the case for some and not others. Because for me, it was very double-edged. There was an interruptive process to the natural grieving, um, because there's closure and making amends and moving forward, and then suddenly there's this what can be very overwhelming information about some kind of perseveration of this deceased loved one, and it's really trying to integrate that all of a sudden when you've already tried to integrate the fact of their having disappeared, um, and yeah, there's a kind of because basically that for me there was a special quality about entertaining the idea that my dad had vanished wholly. The kind of preciousness, like however cataclysmic that kind of is, there's a preciousness to the utter finitude of you and every one of your loved ones, um, and I think that's a special experience and feeling, which just having some experience of believing that there is a beyond and an afterlife and they continue on and you can continue to communicate with them, like, doesn't afford. um yeah.
Also, I suppose our modern culture here isn't set up and doesn't make space for that kind of thing. But you think about cultures elsewhere, or small scale communities, or people in history, there was always a place for the ancestors. There was always a place you could go and have that communication with them, or there is a special time of year that you can commune with them. So it gives it more of a structure, and it's more woven into the fabric of society. But I think we've developed a kind of terror of death, and there's probably is, like you say, some comfort in considering it to be very final, because there isn't the sort of complicated relationship that you have with this person in the other realm, because there is no place in society now where we could go, or that it's really understood that we go to this particular place to commune with our ancestor, or to commune with people that have deceased. We can see them in dreams, we can think about them, we could go to their grave, or we could go to somewhere significant to them, but it's not part of our social fabric anymore, which I do think is a shame, because it is something that is coming for all of us. We're absolutely all going to die, none of us can avoid it. So it's kind of crazy that we live in such terror and denial of that reality. So thank you so much for sharing, Pascal. I really appreciate that. I lit a candle for your dad earlier.
Oh, thank you very much, that's very sweet.
Can I just say something about grief that I noticed last year? Yeah, my dad was really poorly, like his health was really like on the edge and he was struggling. And I started to go to these grief circles. There's a lot more people these days holding these spaces for grief, like grief circles, and it was really cathartic for me because it helped me to go through the layers of the anger and the love and the emotions to grief. So I think there is like this kind of movement for people to be like grief holders. Sometimes they're calling themselves like keening, connecting like an old Celtic tradition of lamenting for the dead. But I found it tremendously like cathartic to be able to do that, almost like to prepare myself for his death, which may come sooner than I had thought. He's still alive now, but last year his health was really like tottering on the edge.
I know my friend Tree Carr is a death doula as well, and that there is now a movement to have people with you when you're passing over, because it can be not only stressful for the person dying, but the relatives of the person dying get incredibly stressed. And very often they say that when someone is about to die, they'll hold on, they'll wait until the relatives are out of the room to die because they don't want to upset them, or, you know, they feel that anxiety themselves. So I can think, you know, I think it's an amazing and wonderful thing to do, to like hold someone's hand through dying, because we have a midwife, we have someone there when we're born into the world, but we still don't know what death really is. It could be like a being born into some other type of existence. And I think if you go into it fearfully, then it's going to be a different kind of experience. You know, there's this idea that it's important to die well and to have a good feeling as you're dying in order to enter into a happy afterlife. But we don't know, because very many people have near-death experiences in extraordinarily traumatic circumstances and have an absolutely gorgeous, beautiful, miraculous experience. So, and it helps them to release their fear of death. So we just don't know. Danny.
Hiya. Yeah, I wanted to respond to a couple of things that came up there that Pascal said. One was about the Psychic College of London bought its London property on the proceeds of the First World War, and particularly people going to connect to loved ones who've been lost in the First World War, which I think is super interesting. I'm really curious about this grieving process. My details as a palmist are online, and loads of the people who kind of Google psychics, I'd probably say about half are looking for looking for contact with loved ones. It's really, really common. And something that just occurred to me as you were talking there, Pascal, is how different people respond to that grief. Because one of the things that Jung commented was that the unconscious doesn't seem to care at all about death. And as people are approaching death, their dreams don't get panicky around it, apparently, which I thought was quite interesting. And I've noticed also, um, I think there's one of the things that neurodivergent people seem to do differently is uh, how they approach death, or how they approach the grief around death. There's this guy Daniel Tammet who he's a kind of maths genius, but also highly neurodivergent, and he tells a story about how he was at a he was at a woman's house and her son had died in a hanging, and he was kind of completely oblivious to that. He was asking questions, oh, how did he do it, and like, how did you find him? He was asking all these quite pointed questions without any kind of understanding that he might be really upsetting this woman. And I've seen similar in my family, actually. When my own my father is kind of very, very far up the neurodivergent spectrum, and he's got language and stuff. He's yeah, he's very, very Asperger's. And when he heard about he left the table to take a phone call once, and he came back and he continued eating his dinner, and he kind of says in passing, "Oh, my mum just passed away." And I don't think it was really like overwhelming grief that made him just continue chewing on his baked potato. I think like I feel like different people have very different responses to death according to how their brains are wired up. And I'm wondering if the way that the autistic and kind of neurodivergent brain seems to kind of branch a whole lot more and that's linked to what happens with the psychedelically switched on brain, which is also kind of branching a whole lot more and making a whole lot of connections, and also doesn't seem to be so kind of focused on the fact of death or grieving about the fact of death. Anyway, those are kind of a couple of questions that got thrown up by what you're saying there, Pascal. I will say one more thing actually, like that question of whether the funeral is for the dead or for the living. I had to do a funeral once. I used to do a lot of weddings, but then someone asked me to do a funeral, which is a whole different state of affairs. And it was a family, it was a father, and he was quite a bad guy. Like he'd left like wreckage in his family. It was three daughters and a son. His son hadn't talked to him for about 15 years, and his fiance. And yeah, the funeral it was really, really interesting. At one point, because they all had this unexpressed anger towards the guy, I did a bit of an empty chair exercise, the Gestalt exercise. So I kind of, this was during COVID actually. This is super interesting because the funeral parlor called me up and they said, "What are you going to do for the funeral?" And I said, "Well, we're going to sing a few songs." They went, "No, no, no, you're not." And I went, "Oh, okay. Well, we're going to burn it. No, you're not going to burn a candle." And they said we couldn't do anything. And I called them up the next day and I threatened them with a legal case. And I said, if you're not going to let us express our religion as we wish, I'm going to do you for breach of the Equalities Act. And they said, okay, do what you want. But the funeral parlors were like involving themselves in funerals in a way that I really, well, for one thing, I really wonder what that's done to the ghost community, who've been grieved really badly and died really badly during the COVID times, because we've been burying our dead for a very long time, and partly just on a physical level, you really don't want decomposing bodies sitting around your community. But then there's something else which happens when you die, and if you don't, I think if that doesn't get grieved properly, then it can, it can infect the living in a really very big way. So in this particular funeral, I I asked them to speak in their heads and kind of close up any stories, like to say anything, and then we sung like that they hadn't said to their father, and then we've sung a few songs, and then I invited them to speak. And it was really cathartic because the son who hadn't spoken to his father for, I think, 15 years, it was a long time. He got up and he said some really beautiful words about his father, and the various daughters who'd struggled, they all had something kind to say as well. Yeah, so I don't know. I'm talking all over the place, but what you were talking about there, Pascal, threw up a whole load of thoughts in my head.
Thanks, Danny. Stephen?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. What you just said about your dad reminded me actually. I was on tour a few years ago and played a festival in Germany, and then I came back to London, and my drummer just told me that his dad had died on the Thursday before we'd gone to the festival, and he hadn't mentioned it and played a show and everything, and I've been baffled by it till this day. Actually, what happened? Because I don't think it was that he wasn't grieving, but I don't know why, he just couldn't talk about it anyway. But anyway, that made a bit of sense. Just wanted to pick up on what Tom said. So, Tom, this isn't a grief circle, but nothing to do with our festival, by the way. But I've been doing it for years. We host this thing called Death Cafe once a month, which is just people getting a bit like this, actually, in a way, but just talking about the subject. You could even sort of see it in a strange way as kind of pre-grieving. We're all going to be there, right? So one way of just talking about it is it's actually like getting some of the grief done early, getting in early with your grieving, right? I was very interested in what Gregory was saying about the near-death experience in different cultures. In particular, I've got a question for him in a way here, which is that there's to do with ancestors and to do with cultures where there's a strong belief in ancestors, because I have this. I was up in the mountains last week and we were at a prehistoric site in the middle of nowhere, and a site which would have been, one would assume, would have been a place for the community to do things with their dead, not bury them because they sort of did all sorts of things with their dead, right? And I got an insight which is into those cultures that have got a strong sense of the ancestor, that the ancestors are still with them, right? Whether, incarnate, as it were, or disincarnate, in fact, um, that they would have a very different feeling about dying because they would be becoming the ancestor. So, in other words, death would seem more like a transformation, a transition into something else. You would still be with the community, right? Because I think our feeling about death is that we're going to be gone, right? We're going to be, even if you've got religious beliefs, you're going to be in some other place, right? You're not going to still be with your community. So I think that they would have very different, probably less, I imagine, a lot less fear about dying, right? Um, and so I just wondered what, when Greg was talking about the different cultures of different sort of near-death experiences, and did those cultures with ancestors feel very differently about it? Plus, I guess, just to sort of bring it, lob a new subject in, if we want to talk about it, in Buddhism, there's lots of different visions of death. The Theravada Buddhists believe that the instant that you die, that you're reborn. The middle Buddhists believe that there was a kind of intermediate consciousness which took your consciousness and passed it on, as it were, like passed the parcel. And then the Tibetans obviously have this belief that there's a sort of an in-between world where you go to for, say, 49 days, which sounds a bit like the near-death experience, strangely, because you are presented with lights, etc. I don't think in the Tibetan version there's the chance to go backwards, as it were, but it does have some of the aspects of the near-death experience. Anyway, that will just lob all that stuff in and let it percolate.
Thanks, Stephen.
Yeah, that's really perceptive about the small scale societies that have like those kinds of ancestor beliefs because in a lot of sub-Saharan African communities, I found that they have the ancestors essentially living in the forest or in the scrub nearby where the actual village is, and they don't actually leave. So there's kind of it's a two-sided belief. Sometimes they're potentially malevolent spirits, so they need to kind of placate them. But then sometimes it's just like my mom's still living in the tree. So the relevance of near-death experience to those societies, I think, was pretty low. Like they when they had, well, it's a kind of it's a pretty it is intertwined also with acceptance of death to a much greater degree than we have. And there's examples of missionaries would come across people who were sort of lying around waiting to die, elderly people, and they would say, "Hey, all you need is some penicillin or whatever it is," and it's a very simple process to bring you back to health, and you don't need to die. And they would just say, "No, it's my time to die, and I'm here by my own free will, and I don't really want any help." And so, and part of it was also the importance, as Sarah was talking about, the importance of doing this alone. I think they really just wanted to be left alone in a natural spot, which, we see dogs and cats doing that when it gets to their time. And there are a lot of accounts of people who are dying who will not die when there's still people in the room, and it's almost like um, that's a something they're waiting to happen to have that moment of peace and freedom where there's because it can be a very private thing, I think. It was like that with my dad anyway. Um, but yeah, so it's this kind of complex of beliefs that seems to lead to near-death experiences not being valorized or seen as a particularly religiously significant kind of event. And I think one of them is the focus on the community rather than the individual, as we were talking about. The other one is Stephen's point about the ancestors still living in the community, so we don't need to go visit them because they're already here. And then on top of that, there were also beliefs in the idea that somebody coming back to life was an aberration. They were suspicious that it might have been a victim of sorcery or possession, and so they would actually take measures to prevent bodies from coming back to life. And so they would, in burials, they would bind their hands and feet and pile stones on top of the grave and things like that. And then if somebody did come back to life, there are a couple examples of them being stoned to death or otherwise kind of driven away from the community because it's not that they didn't value the idea of their loved one returning. They just didn't believe that that's what was happening. They thought like this is a walking corpse. And then in Australia, there were quite a lot of parallels with Aboriginal people. They didn't have any. I couldn't find any examples of near-death experiences. It's like one of the only regions and areas of the world that I could not find any NDEs. And then I finally realized it was because they didn't see any significance in the context of the dying and coming back to life. To them, the experience itself was the thing that was important, and that experience made people into shamans, essentially. Like they were considered shamans by virtue of having had the experience, and they were able to make those kind of journeys at will from that point onwards. So, but the kind of root event of the dying and coming back to life seemed to just like they just did not care about that. And there are also parallels in Tibetan Buddhism. They call them dilogs, and they actually did have near-death experiences. And it was again by virtue of that, having had the NDE, that they become, wise people, holy people, or shamanic type figures or whatever, which is a real kind of totally unrelated cross-cultural parallel going on between Australia and Tibet. And it's all also, just to throw another parallel in, uh, completely different in most Native American societies where like they already accept visionary experiences and dreams as sources of knowledge, but they elevated NDEs to like the highest level of knowledge. Like this is, and it's because of the near-death context that they gave it a higher level of knowledge than a deliberately induced otherworld journey or a dream. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, Gregory. Tom.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I just wanted to, affirm my own personal experience when we're talking about ancestors and these sort of encounters and communications with them. I've experienced this a fair amount with my gran, in lucid dreaming and other dreams and journeys of the spirit, and just kind of like checking in on where she is in the afterlife state. That's been really meaningful for me. And then encounters with my auntie as well, Auntie Audrey, and she said things to me that I didn't know about in my physical life, and I was able then to tell my dad about things she was saying. So that was really like, yeah, meaningful for me. And then more recently, just final thing to say, one of my mum's ex-partners, who's died recently, seemed to be coming through a lot, but he was really interesting because he was a very evolved soul. And he was like totally radiant, like when I experienced him. And I think that sometimes, the forms that these ancestors can take can be dependent on either their evolution or how they're getting on in the non-physical. So I just wanted to honor my own experience rather than, by sharing that. And also I think there's someone in the chat called Camilla that wants to say something.
Hi. I'm not sure if you guys can listen to me. Can you guys confirm? All right. Well, this is not related completely to the meeting. I'm sorry for interrupting you guys. I didn't mean to be rude or anything. I just gotta go because I'm at university right now. Just wanted to praise Ms. James for her panel conversations. I really enjoyed it. And I found them very interesting and very fascinating to learn a little bit more, because I've already seen the other videos. So basically that, and that I also admire some of the people that are here. For example, Mr. Coates. I don't know if you can hear me. And yeah, basically that, and that I wish I could stay a little longer, but my teacher is calling me. So yeah, basically that's what it is. And sorry for my bad English. I'm just a little nervous.
No problem. Thank you so much, Camilla.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Camilla. Nice to see you.
I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of experiences of death in life, because I think that we have this idea of life and death being very binary in the modern world. But to me, it seems like life and death are always entangled, entwined. There's always part of us dying. There's always part of us being reborn. And I think we see this really clearly in those transitional phases of our life, like puberty, or babyhood, childhood, puberty, midlife, menopause. These kinds of things are like a death that happens while we're still alive. And we do see in small scale societies and in a lot of ancient societies, these transitions are honored and recognized as being something like a death. And I think that it's part of the reason why people in the modern world are so lost, because we don't have these important transitions respected, honored, and recognized or ritualized in any way. I just went to the sanctuary of Artemis at Boronia, just north of Athens, yesterday, and I was really struck by how beautiful it was. And it's this really gorgeous, very, very ancient sacred precinct dedicated to the goddess Artemis, where young girls, before they were ready to be married off, were sent by the Athenians to it's all based around this myth that there was once a tame bear that lived at the sanctuary, because Artemis is a goddess or related to the bears and related to a bear cult. And it all revolves around a myth of one of the girls at the sanctuary chasing a bear and teasing it until the bear scratched her, and her brothers killed the bear, and Artemis, as punishment, made all Athenian families send their daughters to play the bear at her sanctuary. So they would dress up in these saffron-dyed robes imitating bears and playing like she bears and cubs, and they would have to take part in athletic sports and dances and make animal offerings and things like this. And then it seems like the final ritual is this shedding of the bear skins and running around naked and frolicking. And then by the time they leave the sanctuary, they're ready to be married, and they're ready to enter into the marital bed, and they sacrifice their childhood clothes and their childhood things. And I just think that our experience of childhood now, and our experience of puberty, and our experience of entering into relationship is really muddy and confusing for so many young people, and people would do so much better if we were able to go through some sort of held initiatory social event to mark how we've changed, because we do change so much. You know, I often think about how different I am now to what I was when I was a baby. Like, we are dying all the time and being reborn all the time. Our journey is this long process of change, and the more you accept those deaths within life, the less terrifying death becomes, because it seems like surely it's just some other transition that we're going to go through, and we're going to find ourselves somewhere else. So I just wanted to share that. Thank you. Tom.
Me, Tom.
Yeah, you, Tom.
Me, Tom. I didn't know what I was going. I didn't have anything to say, but what can I say to that? I totally agree with what you're just saying. I think that for me, my rights of. Sorry, what? Okay, yeah. So yeah, me, my kind of. I resonate with that. My rites of initiation into sexuality were not ideal in any way, and I think that you're totally right. I think there are more people trying to bring that into young people's lives. I know people that are mentoring young people and kind of helping them through these rites of initiation, but the average Westerner doesn't necessarily have those wise role models or people in their local community. Usually it's just down to your parents, isn't it, or your teachers at school. And they're often, they have limited resources, or they have limited knowledge, or so the more we can bring that back, the to have these small rites of initiation, and also just to allow ourselves to treat each day as a fresh day, and we die each night in a way, and are reborn every morning. So if we can all live vividly in that way, then the world would be a better place.
Thanks, Tom. Emily.
Hi, yeah, I'm sorry, my comment is a little more relevant to what Gregory and Tom were saying before. This very interesting point you just raised, Sarah, but just circling back a little bit to the idea about encountering the dead in dreams. So I study medieval, I'm a professor of medieval Arabic literature. That's what I study, and magic in particular, medieval Islamic magic. And one thing that I've always been really struck by in that body of literature is there's this a strange absence of ghost. So although in the sort of ancient Greek and Roman magic and seemingly in the later European Western Christian magic, you get sort of necromancy of communicating with ghosts or encountering ghosts in various locations. You don't see it all that much in the medieval Islamic literature. And the places where you'd expect to find a ghost, where people seem to sort of intuitively sense that something's there, like, for example, in ruined houses or in bathhouses, um, you instead encounter the jinn. So it's as if people know something's there, but instead of saying this is the ghost of the dead, they said that it's the jinn, which, who are sort of invisible, shape-shifting beings made of fire who are like humans in some way, but are not human. Um, However, where you do encounter the spirits of the dead a lot in medieval Arabic literature is in dreams. And it's so mainstream that uh, even if someone's like biography, after they die, they will include in the biography, and such a person dreamed about them after they died, and they told about the state of their soul. And this is considered, such important and ordinary information that it's included in their biography in that way. And certain dreams of especially of holy men or the Prophet Muhammad, for example, are considered extremely important sources of information and learning. Um, and part of the reason why that's so is because there's this kind of purgatory. I think it's maybe even etymologically related to the Tibetan word bardo. I can't prove this, but it's barzakh. So it's this kind of intermediary space, which is sort of like a purgatory. It seems to be adjacent to the land of dreams. It also seems to be the sort of imaginal realm that is inhabited by the jinn. So there's this kind of intermediary space between the land of the living and the afterlife, where these kind of imaginal forms, including the dead and a kind of state of purgatory, dwell. Um, and you do encounter them in dreams. And I mean, so we talk about near-death experiences and the universality of that experience and how that might have affected our notions of the afterlife. I think another experience that seems to be more or less universal, but obviously gets interpreted differently by different cultures, is these dreams of the dead, where you encounter somebody who's been close to you, who's died, and it is not like an ordinary dream. It's not like you're just going through your memories of them. There's something about them where it's like this person is a ghost, and sometimes you even know it while you're dreaming. It could often, in my case, it often makes me kind of lucid when this happens, especially when I dream of my father. Um, and it really gives you the impression that every time you go to sleep, I mean, talking about the little deaths we die in our ordinary life, every time you go to sleep, you're practicing for death. You're going to a land adjacent to the land of the dead and getting and hopefully getting better at navigating that space because there is, also the belief that when you die, you're going to find yourself in a sort of dream realm and you're going to need to try not to get lost and go the right way. And after my dad died, sometimes he did seem confused, and then other times it felt like he was finding his way successfully. And sometimes I even felt that maybe I could help him if I were better at dreaming, that I could somehow, um, that we could figure it out together. So I feel like, yeah, people have a sense of souls persisting after death, but the way that they articulate where those souls can be found differs slightly. But the land of dreams seems to be like almost everybody seems to be sort of in an agreement that this is. Well, maybe Gregory, you've looked at a lot of other cultures as well, and you can tell me a culture that doesn't think that the land of the dead is adjacent to the land of dreams, but I'm not personally aware of any. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Um, no, not that I've never read anything where that was explicitly stated anyway.
Yeah.
And I think in general it is kind of seen as the same type of state of being, if not literally the same realm, the same kind of, maybe you're approaching that realm through dreams, even if you're not actually going to it. I'm just thinking again about it's overgeneralizing, of course, because there's so many Native American tribes, but the kind of hierarchy of the value they gave experiences, and dreams were at the bottom between visionary experiences and NDEs. But I think they still at the same time saw dreams as a kind of glimpse of what the afterlife is like, but probably acknowledged that it was filtered through all the crap that gets into our dreams on a daily basis anyway.
Mm.
Um, and I understand that experientially as well, because what you were saying about your dad reminded me of a dream I had about my dad after he died. And it was it seemed incredibly real. It was not a lucid dream, but it had the reality of a lucid dream, and that immediacy and kind of hyper intensity awareness, which often seems like even more real than this world, which is like what lucid dreaming and NDEers often say. Um, but it was like this kind of misty, amorphous kind of landscape, and my dad is there wandering around, and it was very brief. And I said, "Where are you?" And he goes, "I don't know, Mars or somewhere." And he's kind of like, and it was a kind of ridiculous response, but I woke up, and this is, 15 years ago, and it's still really, really vivid. So I wonder if it's almost like NDEs, where it's like this, there's something that's real about the actual experience, but our subconscious clothes it or projects imagery or ideas onto it that makes sense because, I don't know if it's like genuinely my dad's spirit said, I don't know, Mars or somewhere, or if I was sensing a confusion of his actual spirit in another world, and
Mm.
I projected that moment onto it. And I felt the same thing with like out of body experiences that I've had during dreams. I've never had one in a non-dream or lucid dream state. And so I always wonder, was that really an out of body experience, or was my brain modeling an out of body experience through a dream? And is there even a difference? I don't know.
Mhm.
Sorry, I just kind of ramble,
Thanks,
but
Gregory.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
It makes me think, I've always thought that when we've created ideas about the afterlife, it's been based on dreams, because dreams are just such an ordinary, everyday human experience. They often make it possible for us to commune with the dead. And when we commune with the dead, especially the dead that we really like or the dead that we're really terrified of, those dreams feel incredibly real and profound. And I think that it would have given ancient people some immediate, direct belief that the soul goes somewhere, or that the person perpetuates in some other realm. And if you look at something like the Orphic gold tablets, where you've got instructions for the afterlife that you have to do, you have to not drink the oblivion inducing waters of Lethe, you have to carry on and drink the waters of Nimotini. And then you look at the books of Coming Forth by Day, where you get all these very explicit instructions for how to navigate the duat. I think that they are experiences that come first from dreams. I think dreams, if we love someone and they die, we're going to dream of them. And the dreams that we have with them are going to feel emotional, and dreams are made up of so much emotion. But also in ancient Egypt, you get tales of the dead coming back to haunt the living in dreams and punishing them by giving them nightmares and stuff like this. So there seems to be this association with the dead, and in necromancy, this idea that the dead have special access to information about the future as well. So I think, Emily, there is this universality of the dead are accessible in dream states. And some of the earliest evidence for any kind of like dream ritual or any kind of ritual is sleeping or inhabiting spaces next to graves or where people are interred. So that there's this idea of by proximity, even somewhere like Çatalhöyük, you have it, where sleeping platforms are intentionally built above skeletons that are buried underneath the dwellings. So there seems to be some intentionality with that, I think. And it makes sense that people would have had these experiences of communing with the dead in dreams, and that influenced the development of religion and spiritual beliefs from the very beginning, I think.
And that idea of conscious dying is very much a Buddhist thing, and there's a lot of examples cross-culturally as well. Again, a Native American example where the guy has to actually think his way over a river crossing, and it's stated in those terms very clearly. And in the Upanishads, there's a text about it's a mythical sort of NDE about a little boy traveling to the other world, and he has to travel through the chariot of his mind, is the way they put it. So, but I think that is all true about dreams. But I think as far as NDEs go, it's the kind of set of all the similar cross-cultural phenomenological components, which you don't have that in dreams. It's like this, 9 or whatever elements are like sort of transposed onto different cultures in a way, and it's often in a kind of, it's always in an afterlife context, that kind of defines what the text is about. But I think that because of that, it kind of indicates to me that at least the journey to the other world is, kind of predicated on NDEs in beliefs around the world. At least the journey of, maybe not the idea that ancestors are living in some other realm, because it probably is largely influenced by dreams as well. But the journey, I think, has got to be grounded in NDEs cross-culturally.
Emily, do you want to say anything?
Oh, no, I'm good for now. Thank you.
Stephen.
Thank God, so much rich stuff there, Emily. That was very interesting to hear that. Just wanted to drop this in quickly, maybe in terms of what Gregory's been talking about, is that I'm sure some people here are familiar with Irving Winkle from the British Museum, and he wrote the book about Mesopotamian ghosts, and it's just interesting in that culture because the architecture is the community is built around a courtyard, and in the courtyard there's a well, and he says that the ghosts were in the well, and the ghosts were communal ghosts. So when a ghost was causing trouble, it was because there was trouble in the community. So they weren't sort of related to like an individual life or an individual relationship, right? Sarah was saying about, we go through several deaths in our lifetimes, and I think that's absolutely right. And there ain't the initiatory transitions that we need to do that. Funny enough, I was on retreat last week and I was dreaming non-stop, but I had one night I dreamt of my dead father actually, and I also dreamt of an ex-lover who had written me a report on our relationship. In fact, she was going to publish it in the Times. Um, and then also a friend who I'm no longer in contact with. And these were like three deaths, one actual real death, my father, and then this ex-lover, and then a friend I've fallen out of contact with. So you've got all this situation where we are dying all the time, and dreams are, of course, it makes absolute sense, doesn't it, that we would frame the afterlife around our experience of dreaming. I wanted to also drop in the Celtic mythology, it's seen that fairy, the land of the fairies, is also the land of the dead. Those two things are connected very strongly, so that it's not just the land of dreams, but it's the land of the others, as it were. And this is just to finish off a question for Sarah, really, because, and I may have got this completely wrong, but in the Greek mythology, the underworld seems this rather grim place. Um, it's, even in the Tibetan version of the afterlife, there is an opportunity to get enlightened and also to come back in the realm of the gods or even in the realm of the humans and have another go, right? In the Christians, you got heaven and all this sort of stuff if you can avoid hell. But in the classical mythologies, it seems rather dull. It doesn't seem appealing at all. There doesn't seem much to recommend it. But Sarah, maybe you can enlighten us why it's going to be all right in the end.
There's a lot of kind of grayness
Mm.
and a lot of the kind of lost and obliterated, wandering aimlessly. And the land of dreams is there as well, the fields of asphodel. But then you have the islands of the blessed, which is where you get to go if you remember to drink the waters of Nimosini. You can take your place amongst the heroes on the Isles of the Blessed, and that's pretty good, I think.
What do you have to, how do you remember?
So if you're an Orphic initiate, you get a little passport, which is printed on, I made one for Pascal actually the other day, and it's printed on gold leaf, and then it's rolled up into a scroll, and you wear it as a necklace, and it says something along the lines of, it's basically instructions for when you're dying and you're walking into Hades, and it says, even though you're parched and you're really, really thirsty, you're going to see the trunk of a white cypress tree shining in the gloom, but you mustn't drink the water that's gushing out from its roots. You have to carry on and ignore Lethe, this water of oblivion that's going to make you forget, and you're going to end up like a zombie wandering aimlessly around Hades. You have to carry on to meet the guardian of the waters of Nimosini, the goddess of remembrance, and she's the goddess of divine remembrance. So it's important to realize that she is the child of Uranus, the god of the heavens, and of Gaia, the goddess of the earth. So she's a product of the union of heaven and earth coming together. And you have to say to the guardian, I am a child of the earth and starry heavens. Permit me to drink the water of memory so that I may take my place amongst the other initiates. That you are a child of the earth and starry heavens, but my race is of heaven alone. This you know yourself. And then you drink the water of remembrance, and you remember that you're actually born from the stars, and you can go and live on the Isles of the Blessed with the heroes.
That's quite a lot to remember.
I think, you get to practice this in dreams, don't you? And I guess it's not just about remembering the script, it's about remembering that you actually are you have actually come from the stars, and you have some star stuff in you, so you can never die, because that star stuff part of you is totally immortal. And you can say that, but you can also really feel it and know it, and then you are immortal.
Thank you.
Can I just mention just very quickly on that? It's interesting about the other. May I take my place, amongst the other initiates? And I'm sure that's referring to the other initiates of the Orphic traditions or similar, but also just of people who have existed and have died and have done whatever they needed to do, psychospiritual, whatever, in order to attain that right, to take their place there. And so that kind of reminds me of what I was going to say before to your thing, Sarah, that you're talking about initiation and like dying in life, and we don't have initiations, and in the sense that life itself is a kind of initiation for death. And obviously you've got loads of traditions that do that, and obviously the Tibetan one and probably the ancient Egyptian and everything, but there's another guy, Mark Mirabello, who's some like scholar of religion, anthropologist person, and his book about different conceptions, of the afterlife across different traditions and things. He talks about some who believe that we're literally already dead, like this is the land of the dead, or we're just dead basically. And it's just one interesting way of dissolving what I think is must be some kind of false dichotomy between this life and the next, like this idea of this is life and then that's the afterlife, and that it's so that's just something I wanted to mention with that. But also what was I going to say? I've totally forgotten now. What were you saying, Sarah, before the initiates of the...
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because before I forget, I wanted to say as well that reminds me what you were talking about with regards to this life is actually death, is this idea of the Mistai taking part in the Eleusinian mysteries, because part of the philosophy of taking part in those rites is this recognition that the body is actually the tomb for the spirit. And so you begin the sacred way at Keramakos, the ancient cemetery of Athens, because you're walking the path from death to life, to true eternal life, which is recognizing your divine spark that's come down from the heavens and been successively cooled as it passes through all the different planetary spheres until it's inside you, and your body is like a tomb for this divine, living, eternal spark.
I love that. Yeah, I've taken note of that to add on to that. I realized the previous thing was what you're saying about the the river Lethe, and the what Stephen was saying before about the general kind of gloominess of that. But that's prior to hopefully drinking from the pool of the Nacini, and then taking your place amongst the stars. This kind of more luminous realm. And that, I wonder what Gregory thinks in terms of that being a kind of parallel to this very cross-cultural phenomenon with near-death experiences when it comes to darkness. Going from the beginnings of the NDE to a space of darkness, which then ultimately merges into light. And cross-culturally that manifests differently. You have like the kind of classic sort of there's light at the end of a tunnel, or it can be more dramatic, like a real dark place, like hell-like place, until some kind of Deus Ex Machina thing of like some luminous god appearing. And so yeah, I wonder what Gregory thinks of that. And also, Gregory, didn't you say in some of your books that it's a bit of a misnomer about the ancient, or at least the Greek, kind of afterlife / underworld being this very, very dark, gloomy, boring place, and there's still beings of light which are described, and things like that?
Yeah, that was with the Sumerian afterlife mostly, that it's been a kind of scholarly received wisdom that the Sumerian afterlife was all kind of gloomy and dark and depressing. And because of that, it's been such an accepted thing in that field that people have been resistant to reading what's in the actual text, especially as more and more texts are translated. They're still kind of sticking to that narrative, but there are quite a lot of descriptions of light and darkness and meeting ancestors and feasting and positive elements. Uh, but yeah, and the it's I think darkness and light are pretty practically universal elements of NDEs. You probably know Mark Fox's book, Religion, Spirituality, and Near-Death Experience, and he's talking about all the different models that near-death studies researchers have come up with to try to codify NDEs. Is it the Grayson scale, or is it Moody's model, or whatever it is? And he reduced it to basically darkness and light, like within the near-death context, and that's it. So yeah, I think that's pretty universal. But what Sarah was saying about the Greek text and equating the soul of the dead, or the entombed soul of the dead within the living person, with the divine, that's also another really common cross-cultural sort of element. I'm thinking of in Indian traditions, there's this equation of the Atman with Brahman, and the Atman is like the inner unchanging self that stays. It's the thing that's you and who you are even throughout your subsequent reincarnations. Um, and that's equated very explicitly in these afterlife texts with Brahman, which is like the universal divine oneness of all reality, the ultimate reality. And so a lot of these texts say basically you have to realize that there's no difference between Atman and Brahman if you want to have a positive afterlife, or if you want to get off the wheel of rebirth and not be reborn, depending on what the specific tradition is. But that essential idea that you are one with the divine is the kind of key, and it's in Egyptian text as well, because the soul in the afterlife is constantly being equated with the sun god Ra, who's a being of light, with the god of the dead Osiris, who's a rebirth deity, and it's stressed that they're kind of like all one, and they're one with you. So it's not like you just ride with the sun god through this cosmos into the underworld. You actually are the sun god and you are the god of the dead. And in Mesoamerican as well, like there's the Maya texts about that the soul is a fragment of the sun. So it's really this I wouldn't go so far as to say universal, but it's a extremely common cross-cultural idea that we are divine sparks.
Thank you, Gregory. Joe.
Hi, thanks. It's so much going on, so many synchronicities. The the gold foil tablet that you mentioned, that started me writing a book on metempsychosis and the preservation of consciousness after death. And then during the writing of that book, I had a kind of dream sequence where I kept getting these words, kindle the bones. And then I did some research and I realized that our ancestors, if we are British, slept on barrows. And so they would go there in order to receive intelligence, guidance, etc. So there were dream practices. In Norse paganism, there's still a practice called Uttrseder. I'm probably not pronouncing that right, where you would sit out all night. So I'm not sure if that's always sleeping or if sometimes it's staying awake all night and receiving, information from the dead. And then apparently Odin, Wotan, was in some theories potentially the god of the dead. And he sacrifices himself to himself on Yggdrasil and receives the runes, which are this technology for kind of multi-dimensional travel through different planes of existence, showing that he pushed himself to the edge of death because death was the place where you got information. Death was the place that you went through either dreams or sacrifice, or through the ancestors, and that idea of the proximity, as you say, you mentioned the platform, where people would actually go out and sleep on these things. And then I've moved to this place in Devon, and I've been going to this place, and I've discovered that it's a barrow and there's a tour enclosure. So I'm really dying to actually do it. I'm kind of scared to do it by myself. So yeah. There's more, but I feel like that's sort of
any volunteers to go and sleep with Joe on top of the barrow?
Yeah, it's in North Devon. So there you go.
I've just come back so I've just finished a retreat, and the theme of the retreat was the water of life, and it was based around the pilgrimage to see the miraculous icon of the Virgin on this tiny Cycladic island. That the location of this icon was revealed to a nun in terrifying visions of the Virgin. The Virgin apparently descended from heaven, but the descriptions of the Virgin are that she's this kind of fearful, fiery goddess type character, and she keeps appearing to this nun in dreams and visions. And the nun is really humble and it's like, oh, I don't want to make a fuss. I don't want to be the one who's found this icon. So she ignores it for ages till eventually she can't anymore. And the Virgin is becoming more and more aggro. And then she tells the nun the exact location of this icon. She even tells her the person in the village who needs to dig it up and where it's going to be found. So eventually they do find it. And this icon has magic powers because in Greek Orthodoxy, the icons are believed to be like houses of the essence of the saint and contain magical powers. And so there's this amazing pilgrimage that happens every year. And we had a quite miraculous occurrence because the storms were really rough and the sea was really rough because we get the Meltemi winds going through the Aegean this time of year. And so we got to the island 2 days early, and none of the other pilgrims, if they didn't go there early, could get there because all the boats were cancelled. So there's supposed to be like 30,000 pilgrims. There were about 5. And so we had the whole church to ourselves. It was absolutely incredible. So we kissed the miraculous icon. And then they have a magic spring there. They have a holy spring. So we collected the water of life. But yeah, it made me think that a lot of these pagan beliefs have transferred to Orthodoxy and Christianity and Catholicism as well. And the saints have taken the place of the gods and the dead in many instances. But you obviously get this in Orthodoxy and Christianity and Catholicism, you have this idea of relics. And I think that, we make these elaborate like shrines to these particular relics. And I think that I'm giving a talk about the Eleusinian mysteries, or some of the things I've learned about the Eleusinian mysteries for the Psychedelic Society. And whenever I think about what those sacred objects were that were transported from Athens to Eleusis, I think of how the saints' relics are paraded, and the fact that anything that was considered to once have actually belonged to the goddess, to be the original stalk of wheat that was the first stalk of wheat that was ever harvested, they would have had this extraordinary like power and prestige, and it would make sense that they would be paraded the way saints' bodies are today. But I think people often get really angry that like modern religions have destroyed paganism, but I think we have a lot to thank them for, because I think they preserve a lot of the ancient understandings and knowledge and wisdom from those times. And in Greek Orthodoxy, I think you can see it really clearly. Thank you very much, Joe. Danny?
Thanks.
I just had a really small comment and question to ask, but since what Joe said there and what you said there just set off a whole load of things in my head that I just want to mention here a little bit. When Odin comes down off the tree, he only ever speaks in poetry, and and I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to articulate this properly. I feel that what's on the other side, like one of the differences between the dream world and the world of the dead, is logos and mythos. Is like logos apply, like logic applies here, and it doesn't there. And it makes me think, so that the barrows that you mentioned, one of the super interesting things I learned about them is that bees will often swarm above Celtic burial sites. And bees you regularly find at that place between kind of chaos and order, and the place between life and death, or life and non-life. For example, you have honey cakes being given to after women give birth in Egyptian stories. In Hebrew, a bee is Deborah, like Deborah, and dabar means word and logic and phrase and all those kind of things. So there's definitely something very, very curious about all of that and how the different rules apply. In terms of what we say and how ideas are put together. What I initially wanted to respond to is this idea of the dream world having access to the dead. I think the dead also have access to us in our dreams, in the sense that there's a particular type of magic you see in Greek magic. I mean, there was a Greek woman, a Greek witch, who told me of a particular magic, which is where if someone's being an arsehole to you, you can petition their ancestors to make them behave. You can say, look, you're being misrepresented. Is this how you want to be represented on this planet or on this plane? Look how your descendants are doing. And then those ancestors can then go and speak to you through those places where they can access you. She didn't mention it being in your dreams, but I feel like that's a really good way of doing magic if you need to, like through the ancestors and through the dead. So I'm curious if anyone's got anything to say about how the dead can be leveraged in magic. And I'm curious about if anyone has something to say about what exactly is going on in the Spiritualist Church, because I've seen such extraordinary things, from the very mundane to the very lofty, in the Spiritualist Church, and I'm not convinced. I have a feeling that the spirits there are being used as means to communicate something, and I'm not sure if it's Auntie Maud herself who's rocking up in the Spiritualist Church. They're more like. So anyway, I wanted to just kind of throw that open if anyone's got an idea of how the Spiritualist Church. And the main thing I wanted to ask, which has been really troubling me actually since we started talking about it, is this thing about dying alone or dying in company. And I think I'd quite like to die alone. I certainly wouldn't like someone there'd be very certain people who I would be happy to die in the company of. Like for example, I don't really like tripping with many people. There's certain people who I can be tripping with. But I've got a feeling it'd be the same kind of people I'd be happy to die with. The kind of people you can be very, very quiet with and not, not have to say anything. But I think dying in a lot of companies, you'd be trying to kind of keep up some kind of appearance or trying to make jokes or whatever it might be. Yeah. So as we've got such a bunch of interesting people here with lots of different ideas, if you feel like sharing your own, you don't have to go into it, but yes, I'd like to die alone, or yes, I'd like to die in company. It'd be really interesting for me just to get your own perspectives on that. Well, one final thing which does come to mind is there's certain situations where I really wouldn't want someone dying alone. The idea of a child dying alone sounds just uh, horrific, and I have a feeling that the spirits wouldn't even let that happen. In the sense that I think the spirits would rock up at a child's death. Maybe they rock up at everyone's death, but I think that would be an aberration so grievous that I just don't think it would. I don't think it would happen.
Thanks, Danny. I think that I would quite like to be accompanied by a long-haired Alsatian. I think a dog would make a good death companion, and I think historically they probably have as well. And I agree. I think there are certain people that you wouldn't mind dying with, and then other people, like my mum, for example, I wouldn't fancy dying with my mum. or like you say, somewhere busy, like in the supermarket. I'd find that stressful, I think. I just wanted to say that I know there was one story I read about the dead being petitioned to stop being hounded in nightmares. And there is this idea in Mesopotamia as well of you can send nightmares to people if they're annoying you. But there's this account, I can't remember the names of the men now, but basically like a rich Egyptian was being hounded by a slave Egyptian or a poor Egyptian that I think he had been part of beating to death. And the rich Egyptian was asking his dead dad, he'd written a letter, because there are these letters to the dead, written this letter to the dead saying, can you tell so-and-so to stop hounding me? Because it wasn't my fault that he got beaten to death. So there is a lot of these letters to the dead that have been found. So they are evidence that these ghosts, like you say, are turning up in dreams and causing trouble. Jed.
Hello, really good to be here. Thanks, everybody. That was amazing. I just want to talk a bit. It's kind of a bit off topic, but I want to talk about agency and how. Oh, I don't know if I'm still coming.
Yeah, we can still hear you. Oh, but it's frozen a little bit.
True, I'm on a kind of farm band system here. Yeah, I might have dropped out. I feel like it's working maybe. Yeah. Okay. I'll try and type something into the chat. That would probably be the best way to do it.
Okay. Thanks, Jed. Tom?
Yeah, I just was kind of harking back to the feelings and thoughts about the underworld. I remember a few years ago I was reading a lot of Peter Kingsley's books, and his thing was partly about we need to descend before we ascend. We need to descend into the shadow, into the potentially sort of underground of our being before we ascend to the upper worlds. And I got quite into it, and I can report in my journeys to the underworld, it's very interesting, and it's different. It feels different than the more heavenly upper type kingdoms, but I recommend it to people. If they have a travel plan and they can kind of descend, you can have incredible experiences. I definitely had a teaching by Persephone down there. She gave me very good guidance that I'm trying to live by more now. So I recommend it. It doesn't have to be like that scary or gloomy. It's like a light. It's different. It's like much more like earthy and can feel more stable in a way than the upper realms in a way can feel. And I very much recommend it to explore if people are interested in that.
I was thinking what you said, Pascal, about this idea that we're already dead. And I was talking to my friend Lev Terrace today about I was talking about how we went to Mykonos on the retreat I've just finished, the pilgrimage I've just finished, and how horrible it was and how it didn't feel like Greece at all. And I hate Mykonos. And he was talking about how he worked in a bar for a couple of years in Mykonos, and he had a little glint in his eye as he was telling me this. And so I took it to mean that he had a really wild and fantastic time while he was in Mykonos, but perhaps a time he would not necessarily want to repeat now at this age, which he said, like, he wouldn't want to go there ever again. But we kind of came to the conclusion that every soul has to do at least 2 years on Mykonos, and that our life is really a bit like going through those trials of the duat, of realizing where the water of life actually is, that it's not outside of ourselves, that it's inside of ourselves. I did actually think I was going to die this month because I had a dream, and I wasn't scared about it because in my dream my death was really ecstatic and nice, so I was kind of okay about it. And so just before we did the Delphic Dreaming Symposium, the conference that we just finished in Delphi, I'd had a dream in 2023, and in it I died. Claire Johnson pushed me into the stars, and I sipped the water of life, which was the stars, but it was me dying. And when I was in Delphi, loads of the things in that dream came true, like so specifically and weirdly, that I was walking around in a bit of a kind of dreamlike state the entire time. And then I got stung by a scorpion, and I was wondering, maybe me getting stung by a scorpion was like a little mini death, because it didn't hurt very much, but it did sting me on my Apollo finger. And so I think that dreams can help you prepare to die, and that they are a really useful place to practice dying and to get used to the dying experience. And I've been into dreams since I was really, really little, and I always thought that if you could get really good at dreams, if you could be conscious in your dreams, then you wouldn't have to be afraid of death, and you can just go into that death with your eyes open if you like. And that if you can be lucid as you're falling into death, that you will have the afterlife that is like a dream, like within a dream. A few minutes in life can feel like an eternity. So you can enter into the dream and have the afterlife that you want to have. I think we mentioned that once before when I've done, we did a talk with Pascal and Gregory about near-death experiences and stuff a few years ago. And we were saying that perhaps you just pick your own afterlife. You can just choose. And so living is about working out what you want your afterlife to be, or what you want your life to be in general, I guess.
Can I just jump in? Sorry. I think it was Tom who just gave us a real massive tease about what Persephone said, but didn't say what she said. So if you're happy to share, like, I'm dying to know. Well, not dying to know.
I can tell you exactly what she said to me. She was quite critical that I had so many online students. So I've got like about 34,000 online students that have bought my courses, and she felt that that was quite a remote connection with them, that I needed to take more responsibility for my students. And it was funny because at one point she used the word culpable. You are culpable, and I couldn't quite hear her. And I said, what? And then she said, "Oh, is my English not that? Is my English not that good?" And then I said, "Well, what can I do about it?" And then she swooped down to the banquet table. We were in a big dark hall in a banquet table, and everyone was eating traditional, wonderful communal Greek food. Feta cheese was definitely there. So what she was saying to me is, I need to be at the banquet table with my students as much as I can, and not on the other side of the world.
That's going to be a lot of feta cheese.
35,000 portions.
Yeah. I need to stock up. I could send little parcels to them. I could message them all. What's your address? I'm committed to send you something, a gift, and have more personal contact with you. So the first gift will be feta cheese, and yeah. But that's mostly what she was saying. So, and I think for her, in her wisdom traditions, it's obviously a much more intimate relationship with students and the initiates, etc., etc. So that seemed to be where she was coming from.
On what you were saying, Sarah, before about the duat and that dream experience with Claire Johnson that we spoke a lot about at the Delphi conference. there are two strands that came to my mind, and I think they do intersect. The duet, I mean, as you know, I have a lot of nightmares, and
Not my
sometimes they're
fault.
induced by you.
Definitely not my fault. Pascal blames me for having nightmares because he has them when he stays at my house.
Um, so yeah, I mean, the duet. I've always felt that the duet, the Egyptian duet, was all these tribulations. It's just very beautifully and systematically like drawn out, but that, you know, it is a very cross-cultural thing as well, isn't it? Like, I know from the Greek Orthodox as well, albeit it's not spoken about a lot, there are these aerial toll houses and these tasks and things like that. But it seems very much a projection of just our experiences of life, where life really is just this endless, but maybe not for some bastards, but it is an endless series of trials, tribulations. And obviously we see, you know, these stresses, you know, we see that as manifested in our dream life. And as I've done talks for you about stuff like as the near-death experience being predicated on dreams, or dreams being a useful model, basically, and then as Gregory's talking about near-death experiences then being models for, or progenitors of afterlife narratives like the Egyptian duet or whatever. So yeah, and then the link, I think, with the other thing is the weighing of the heart against the feather in the duet. And if your heart is light in the feather, then your soul won't be consumed by Amit. And so that links the sense of there's this recent book by the neuropsychoanalyst Mark Solms, The Hidden Spring, and he's kind of trying to make this argument for the locus or like originating point of consciousness being the deepmost nodes of the brainstem, because that's where our affective state arises from. So ultimately, it's about feeling. It's not so. It is reductionist, but what he's really talking about is feeling. That's what consciousness ultimately is. And this idea of the spring of life, as you were talking about, the kind of fountain of youth, or spring of life, being that which is ultimately intrinsically within yourself. And you know, and then you have this idea of the kingdom of God from a Christian perspective being within you, always within you, as a Buddha nature, etc. But and you know, Christ was also saying about his burden being light, you know, so he had realized that the kingdom of heaven was within him, and his burden is light, and so thus, you know, his heart was lighter than the feather. And if you manage to do that, you know, as you were saying, in terms of you had this instinct about, you know, if you can navigate your dreams, you can navigate the death space, then, you know, if your heart is lighter than the feather in life, it is in your dreams, and then it is in death. Was basically what I was getting at. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the idea of your heart being as light as a feather, and the feather is the feather of my art. So the feather is the feather of truth and justice and cosmic harmony. It's about, for me, it's about this idea of dying well, of like, if you die true of voice and with a light heart, you'll be okay. Because when it's a bit, I think of death being a bit like, you know, how terrifying sleep paralysis can be. If you enter death in a kind of sleep paralysis type state, then everything's going to feel like it's closing in on you and putting pressure upon you. And I think something similar is going to happen. But you can, you know, some people like Engelbert Winkler, for example, uses the sleep paralysis state to enter into a dream lucidly, because he just pretends that he's got sleep paralysis until he starts lucid dreaming. So I feel like, you know, also you've got to remember that the Egyptians believed the soul and the personality and the intellect reside in the heart, not in the brain at all. The word for brain translates as something like skull offal. So they knew the brain was important for motor function. They had records in their medical papyrus that describe people having brain injuries and then poking about in their brain and noticing that it was making their bodies do different stuff. So they knew the brain was important, but the heart was the vessel for the soul, the personality, and the intellect. And it was carefully preserved, not only so it could take part in that ritual to be weighed against the feather of my heart, but also as a place where the car and the bar, the spiritual components of the deceased, could return to. When they go off on their wanderings, they can come back. And I think, you know, we've done some other panels, I think, where we talked a bit about this idea of the car and the bar, but I think they're really interesting. And I think the Egyptian culture and their spiritual technology and their understanding of the workings of the human spirit are so advanced and sophisticated, actually, if you look at it. Like I've talked before about this idea of the car emerging in the human placenta, and it's seen as a cosmic twin for the baby, and it continues to have this kind of presence, this energetic presence in your life, you know, for your entire life until you die. And then when you die, your car is housed in this car statue that your loved ones give offerings to kind of keep nourishing the car and keep giving your car life force. So it's really sophisticated and well developed. I think they knew things and understood things about the nature of the spirit and the nature of death after life that we've forgotten. I think it's worth taking really seriously, actually, and looking at it in a really kind of logical, scientific, in-depth way, because there's so much information in that, and it's a really sophisticated body of work. Stephen.
Thanks, Sarah. I wanted just to ask people about a slightly different sort of run on this, but just to pick up on what Tom said earlier, it reminded me that Emanuel Swedenborg went to heaven and hell and came back and wrote about it. So, as far as I know, he's the only person who's been to both whilst still alive. A kind of near-death experience on steroids. By the way, his heaven is attractive. It's a bit like the 1960s. I definitely wouldn't mind going there. It's the big park. People are making love and music. It's good. Heaven, is hell also is actually okay. So interestingly, I just wanted to know what people thought about time in relation to death, because this has already come up anyway in terms of near-death experience, but also Tibetan Buddhists place a lot of emphasis on proximate death karma, you know, what your state of mind is when you're, you know, approaching death. We've already mentioned that here, right? But it seems to me that like we can only perceive time when we've got senses. So you know, in dreams you've got a sense of time, but it's not actually you're kind of out of time. You know, it doesn't relate to what's going on in waking life. In the realm of the fairy, you know, we know that hundreds of years can pass, you know, before you come back to this life. So it's like almost like it's not the afterlife, because that would imply that there's a long line which is our life and then everything happens afterwards. You could see it more as like the other life. It's outside that line. And so time's going to be completely different. That is why it is possible to talk about eternity when you're dead, because eternity really doesn't mean going on forever. It just means that there isn't any time, you know. So I was just wondering what people's thoughts were on death and time.
For me, that's a massive part of it, because it's a massive part of dreaming, that our time is limited to the motions of this planet moving through space. And that is a speck of time in comparison with the greater cycles of cosmic time. And I always think about the Dr. Seuss book, Horton Hears a Who. You know that story where there's an elephant and he finds a speck of something on a flower, and it turns out it's like another world that's got a little mare on it in a town, but only Horton's got sensitive enough hearing to hear this town person talking. I think it's like the best book a kid could ever read to like think about metaphysical, weird, esoteric stuff. And So there must be this greater cosmic time. Like, I always loved that, you know. I think there's an episode, there's one of the Superman films, he flies really fast around a planet, and I always remember that blew my mind because he had escaped time somehow. And when people say that, you know, if you were in a distant planet looking back on Earth, you'd be looking at it at the time of the dinosaurs. I always find that kind of stuff like really mind-blowing and amazing. So there must be this cosmic time, or these different times happening simultaneously, and time can change even from person to person, or even in our own experience. Like this week I've just done, because we're going to different places all the time, seems like it lasted about 3 weeks, but I can have 3 weeks that feel like it was only about 1 week because you're staying in the same place. So time is really very flexible. And I guess even our modern contemporary time, where we're constantly setting our alarm to get up, where we're working according to the clock and we're working certain hours, is very different to waking up at dawn every day and going to sleep when it gets dark. So I think time is huge. And I think that the idea for me of connecting to some sort of collective consciousness, to accessing future or the past, is about making contact with that outside of time space, for sure. Like, I think that dreams have been a direct experience of that for me, where you drift off for 2 minutes but it feels like you've been asleep for 2 hours. There was a really good radio documentary I listened to once about this guy who was in a coma, and he dreamt, he was only in a coma for 2 weeks, but he had this coma dream that he was in a war in Australia for 2 years. And when he woke up, the nurses were Australian that were attending to him. So he had created this extraordinarily long. So that always gives me faith about death as well, because I kind of think you can live for eternity in a microsecond. So death is probably something like that.
Maybe you have you could have one of these panels on time.
Ooh, let's do time next. Yes, please. That would be great.
It's about time. I mean, I might just say a little thing to that, because I was going to mention what you just said, Sarah, and which is a bit kind of echoing what Anthony Peake likes to talk about. But essentially, yes, there's like the near-death state, looking neurologically. There's such an extreme functionality, kind of ironically, in terms of what we would originally consider as being like disorganized brain state. And there's obviously temporal correlates, because you have, you can live your, you may have a cardiac arrest for less than a minute, but you've relived your entire life. You may have this kind of mystical encounter with like quote unquote eternity as like timelessness or whatever. Yeah, so I'm glad that you have an optimistic perspective on that. But if we've also said at many points already about the mind-dependent nature of the dying experience or afterlife type experience, then you don't really want a fraction of a second drawn out into eternity, which the valence or content of which is not pleasant. And I think this is probably what these traditions are very, very acutely aware of, and hence they have a very diligent perspective on like initiating ourselves for that. But so there's this other thing, and obviously I was incidentally just listening to a lot of physics today regarding the concept of the after, like if there's life after death, or and time was brought up. But I don't know anything about physics to really do any justice to that. But it's obviously relevant in terms of kind of possible asymmetry of time and retrocausation and all of that, and possible precognition. And so if there's that malleability of time, obviously what does it mean about death? And then that's the quantum stuff, and then you have relativity itself as well. And each moment is actually just relative to to other observers, and so theoretically, our ancestors are already in existence. Still, rather, the dead are only dead from our relativistic point of view and all that kind of stuff. But so regardless of all that, last thing I wanted to say there is, like, again, sort of echoing the first thing I said, which is about, regardless of all of this kind of I don't know, like intellectual hearsay, there's like, all we actually really know is this now, what we're experiencing right now. And in terms of what Stephen was saying about eternity really not being forever, it's just timelessness. And if you think about the Eleusinian mysteries and how critical they were considered, and just before they were abolished, Praetextatus, this like this character, was he a priest? Basically, he was petitioning against it because, like, he said, life would be aviotos, so life would be unlivable actually if we didn't have it. And so he wasn't really saying any like thing about these experiences of the import of the afterlife. Morescu talks about it, like the immortality key, and I think there's a big misnomer about having import for like afterlife, and realizing that there is an afterlife or whatever. It's all about dying before you die, but in terms of time, there's a Wittgenstein quote where he says, eternity belongs to those who live in the present. And these mystery schools, as we also see with psychedelic experiences like now, not to say that the mystery schools were definitely psychedelic, but they may or may not be, we see that as well. It's like there's a lot to be said about how those experiences can really ground you into like imminent reality of like the present moment, and in that sense you are sort of outside of time. In that sense you aren't ensnared by your ego, and in that sense there is this blurring of this dichotomy of life and death. There is just this kind of Buddhist, like, ever transiently unfolding, like, now, and that is a kind of our, like, eternal life within life.
Eternal life within life. I love that. That's how I feel about it, Pascal. Tom.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about Swedenborg, because I remember reading him when I was younger, and I remember him saying that one of the characteristics of the beings he met in hell was that their inability to communicate with each other. He said that they were so characterized by these emotions of anger that whenever one being tried to communicate with the other, it just made them more angry. And I noticed that a little bit in my life or human life, like our ability to communicate with others. Sometimes we're angry, they're angry, we try and say something, they become more angry, I become more angry. So it's interesting, like, to think about just our communication abilities in life. And I'm reminded of the words as quoted by Shakyamuni Buddha, that those that know we are all heading for death compose their quarrels. So may I do that before my ends come, so that I'm not arguing with people in the afterlife. Yeah, and also he said, actually, he was very interested in space, riffing off this thing about time and space. And Swedenborg was interested in space, but it was like the angels in the heavenly realms, they were reluctant to talk to him about space. And I always thought with my friends it was because they didn't want him to have just a concept about space. He was very curious about space, like the inner world and the space, what it was, but they didn't want to talk that much about space because they didn't want him just to have a concept. So that was an interesting, something I remember about what he said.
Thanks, Tom. Danny, it's midnight here. I'm in Greece at the moment, so I think we'll make this our final parting remark. Danny, make it a good one.
It's a super quick one, actually, and because a couple of people in the chat have been mentioning, I think one of the special dead. I didn't even call him one of the special dead, Gordon White, who died recently. I just wanted to direct people who are listening to a particular solo show he did, and it's called The Purpose of Ghosts, and it's a very different perspective on the dead, particularly talking about a place called Port Arthur and the ghosts from that place. So, yeah, remembering a very, very special dead, Gordon White.
Thank you very much, Danny. So, unless anyone else has got any death desires they want to express, like how do you want to go, Stephen?
Well, that's a very good question. And of course, the big question which we keep asking ourselves is what do we want to happen when we're dead? Not actually, not whether we're going to go to heaven or hell, but what we're going to do with our bodies. We don't get onto that one because I think that's quite important, isn't it? Even if it's not important for us, it's important for the people that we leave behind. And I think that a lot of rituals around death are really for the bereaved, not for the dying person. So I think most people would like the idea of going quite quickly, don't they?
I think I would
Walking
like to
walking on
go.
the beach in Epidavros or Findhorn and just keeling over.
No, I would like to die in a really amazing dream. Like that would be the best way to die for sure.
Okay.
Don't even get out of bed for it. Uh,
Mm.
I don't get out of
Well,
bed
it's
for
quite likely in your case that's what's going to happen.
yeah, I hope so.
Mm.
But has anyone had a premonition of death?
Well, they always used to say that you can't die in dreams, didn't they? But I don't know if that's
I
true.
don't know. I mean, I remember I grew up in the 80s and we were always told that if you dream that you die, then you're going to die in real life because it was in Freddy Krueger films.
Mm.
I was quite scared of dying in dreams up until, well, actually, no, I've been dying in dreams for quite a long time now, but I used to be a bit worried about it when I was a teenager. Um, but yeah, I think how you die is important. I did watch a James Bond film once where they incinerated a coffin and it really put me off cremation. I didn't fancy that. And I used to have nightmares about, we learned in school about people being buried alive during like plagues and stuff and how they'd have little bells and pulleys in the coffin just in case they got buried alive and they could very calmly just be like, excuse me.
Well, we've got as part of
I'm
the
not sure how
festival,
effective that was.
as part of the London Month of Dead festival, we've got a day
Is
at the
it?
day at the Undertakers. You could come along and ask all the questions that you want
Really?
to.
Well, did you ever watch that episode of Toast where he gets buried alive accidentally? It's very funny, actually. It's the perfect antidote to watching that particular James Bond film where he gets cremated because that's really scary. But anyway, thank you so much, everyone. That's been
Okay.
really wonderful. I hope you all have wonderful dreams.
And
And,
death.
and when the time is right, the most peaceful, delightful, and wonderful death ever.
Here, here.
Good night.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.